Hold up. Tomorrow, gonna be absolute chaos. Today, well, not so much.
Gold medal, let's go!
Back on the fly, this here recapping, predicting the World Junior Championship, U18 Women's World, the Men's World Championship, Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. What is happening? It is by far one of the dumbest things I have ever seen. Prepare to die. Figured it was better safe than sorry.
Scores! Nathan McKinnon!
Scores for Canada. Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly. Hello everyone, welcome back to On the Fly. Today we're recapping Day 5 of the Men's Under-18 World Championships happening in Bratislava and Trencin, Slovakia. So we'll hop into today starting the scores from today's game, starting with a 9-1 win for Czechia over Denmark. Now in this game, I'd say really you look at it and not a terrible surprise to see the Czechs end up walking away with this one, especially with the margin that they won it by. But you look at this game, right? The Danes going with their backup and third-string goaltender. You knew going in that this game wasn't necessarily their focus of this tournament, expecting to lose against a relatively good Czech team who's been hot so far at this tournament. We've seen them pull off big wins against both the USA and Sweden, and then as well as a bit of a disappointing loss yesterday against Germany, which for the Czechs coming into this game, for me, was one of the things I was watching for, to see whether or not they were going to be able to have that bounce-back type of game. Credit to them. They got the job done today. They picked up the big 3 points in the standings. And now it's about what's next for the Czechs. Obviously, they're heading into the quarterfinal rounds. A good game for them there. We'll see, of course, whether or not they're going to be able to continue their success through the rest of this tournament as well. Then we'll kind of talk about the Danes. You look at, for them, a game they weren't necessarily trying to win. The result today, definitely an expected one. They end up losing 9-1 to the Czech team. Then on the second game of the day, between Latvia and Norway, a game that had huge implications for the relegation spot over in Group A. A reminder that both last place teams get sent to a relegation game playoff, a one-game knockout, but we'll get to that part in just a little bit as well. But for the Latvians here, an 8-1 win, a really dominant win too. Yes, they gave up some chances going back the other way, but that was the kind of style of hockey that you wanted to see from this Latvian team before they go into their game against the Slovaks, where for Latvia, they want to try and win both games, get themselves a relatively easier opponent. It's looking, at least as of this current moment, like it will be the USA in the top spot in Group B. Yes, they have nothing to play for tomorrow, but a lot of it is building momentum before you go into that game against the U.S. team, because the U.S. is going to be a very skilled team. They're going to play well. If you can continue to play good defensive hockey, shut down opportunities, as well as find some chances like they did today, all of a sudden this Latvian team could potentially pull off an upset against the U.S. team that, you know, has looked okay throughout this tournament. We've seen them struggle at points, and so whether or not the Latvians are going to be able to kind of pull off a big upset there. This tournament, out of any tournaments, I'd say is the most likely for it, especially at the U18 level, where we see an upset a day really to this point in the tournament. And so, as for Latvia, a big win today. They played really well over the Norwegian team. And for Norway, a bit of a disappointing game, I'd say, for them. Just the fact of how quickly they got steamrolled. You know, they last about 10 minutes through the first period, and then 2 quick goals, and from there it was all Latvia, pretty much the rest of that game. And so for Norway, yes, you end up losing this game. You're going to get sent down to the relegation game, where you'll play against likely either Germany, you could see the Danes in there, you could see the Swedes at this point. It's going to be a really interesting one there. But for Norway, they do lose today 8-1 the final. Latvia will pick up a big 3 points in the standings, ensure and clinch their playoff spot at this year's tournament. As we will now shift over to the news section, we'll start here with the Czechs with expectations. And going into yesterday's game against the Germans, expectations were there for them to not only win the group, but kind of dominate their game against the Germans. And they played okay against the German team, and unfortunately just kind of ran into a hot goaltender. Today's game's going right back to the expectation point was more of that expected result. And so credit to the Czech team today. They played exceptionally well and played right to where they should be as far as their expectations go. They do take this one 9-1 the final. Then to the second game the second part of the news with Denmark with decisions. And part of what the Danes did today is they said, you know what? We don't need to play this game against the Czechs. We've won our one game that matters. Of course, with them beating the Germans and basically clinching their spot in the playoff rounds. barring any chaos on the last day, as we kind of talked about. But now it becomes a question mark of what's next for this Denmark team. They're going to go in and play against the Swedes tomorrow. If they can win that game, they're automatically in. They don't have to worry about that. But there's also the potential there for, if Germany ends up winning and the Swedes end up beating Denmark, that the Danes end up still in that relegation game. And so there's going to be a big decision tomorrow, especially around the goaltending position. Will the Danes end up going with Anton Emil Vilde Larsen, or will they go with their second and third string goaltender for that game? It's a good question because there is no right answer, right? You want to try and keep your players as healthy and as really fresh as possible. And so whether that is resting your best goaltender, your best player, should be something to keep an eye on for this Danish team. But decisions, tough ones to make for sure, as they do now look ahead to see if they can make it on to the playoffs and into that quarterfinal round, where they're also looking, depending on where they end up seeding in, like it will be either Canada, Finland, or the Slovaks that they will be facing off in that first round. Should be very interesting, to say the least, whether or not the Danes are going to be able to pull off an upset in that game, because if they can get some good goaltending, anything really is possible there. Then to the third topic of the news today, with Norway with one chance. And now it ultimately comes down to that relegation game. They are relegation bound, and so whether they can beat whoever they end up playing, whether it's Germany, whether it's the Swedes, whether it's the Danes, this Norwegian team is going to see whether or not they are going to be able to pull off that kind of one last big upset at this tournament, because they likely will head into that relegation game as underdogs, especially after their performance in the early parts of this round. I do still think that Norway has a pretty good shot to avoid relegation if they end up playing a team like Denmark. But if they play the Germans, if they play the Swedes, definite heavy underdogs. And from there, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to kind of find their groove. And so for Norway, a big game coming up in that relegation game. They're done for this tournament. They will not play any more games. But now the question does kind of become, well, can they continue anything that they've done and try and find some positives in it? It should be definitely something to keep an eye on there for this Norwegian team, as they do head to the relegation game. Then to Latvia with scoring. And we made a bit of a point on the last day recap where Latvia played, where it was about that they haven't scored a goal yet at this tournament. And I would say that they responded pretty well to that comment. I'd say even 8 goals worth of that comment, right? Where you were a little bit concerned, especially, yes, you start the tournament with 2 really tough games against Canada and Finland, but at some point you need to pick it up and find the back of the net, because otherwise you're never going to be competitive in these games. And so I think it's a perfect game for them going into their game against the Slovak team, where, yes, the game's not going to matter for them as far as the standings go, but as far as the momentum piece, they're going to try and build upon it for their game, likely against the US, could be the Czechs as well. We'll see kind of what's to come there, but a big game for Latvia today, a big 8 goal scored game, and a good sign of things to come for them. We'll see if they can continue that success into their game tomorrow against the Slovaks. But we will shift over now to the standings portion, where we are going to spend a little bit of extra time on today. We'll start with the current standings. We'll see Finland in the top spot with 8 points, the Slovaks in the second spot with 7, Canada in the third spot with 6 points, and then Latvia in the fourth spot with 3, and Norway in that last spot in Group A with 0 points. Over in Group B, we have the Czechs in the top spot with 9 points, the USA in the second spot with 7, both Sweden and Denmark tied in the third and fourth spot with 3 points each, and then Germany in that last spot as of right now with 2 points because their overtime win against the Czechs just the other day. And so that's the current standings. As far as what's to come tomorrow, a reminder, another 4-game slate, the final day of action for tomorrow's games. And so what that means for the standings, we'll start here over in Group A, where in Group A, it's fairly straightforward, I'd say, for the most part. Latvia and Norway are both locked into their spots. The Latvians can't get up to that third spot, even with the regulation win, as Canada holds the tiebreaker over Latvia, and Norway has done their game. So Latvia is locked into that fourth spot, Norway locked into the fifth spot. As well, as far as for Finland, Finland can win their game tomorrow against Canada in any fashion, they will also lock up that top spot in the group, so nice and easy for Finland. However, where it does get a little bit more interesting is the fact that they hold the tiebreaker over the Slovaks. So as long as they basically get one less point or better than the Slovaks, then they will be ahead of the Slovak team at the end of the standings. If the Slovaks win tomorrow against Latvia and the Finns lose, once again with the +1 point, so as long as it's not an overtime win for the Slovaks and an overtime loss or shootout loss for the Finns, it would mean that the Finns would end up ahead of the Slovak team. And so Slovaks are looking for 2 extra points tomorrow over the Finnish team. So if that's either an overtime shootout win and a regulation loss for the Finns, or whether that be 3 points, 1 point, or 0 points for the Slovaks and the Finns. The Slovaks just looking for those extra points to put themselves ahead of the Finns in the standings. If Canada does win in regulation tomorrow and the Slovaks lose, Canada will go into that top spot in Group A. A reminder that the tiebreaker currently sits at Finland ahead of the Slovaks, and the Slovaks have the tiebreaker over Canada. But if Canada were to beat Finland, they would then have the tiebreaker over them as well. And so it becomes a little bit more of that interesting scenario where if it's an overtime win, then it'd come down to the Slovaks. And if the Slovaks lose in regulation, then Canada would go to the top spot. Finland would then be the second spot. And then, of course, if it goes to overtime, Finland would remain in that top spot because, once again, the 1 extra point would put them over. So Finland would be at the 9-point threshold. Canada would be at 8, and then once again, Slovaks, assuming they lose in regulation, would be at 7 points. And so that's kind of the very high level of what to expect tomorrow for Group A. Over to Group B, it's a little bit easier as well, I'd say. It's a little more complicated for the bottom half of the standings, but the Czechs and the US, the Czechs are in that top spot right now with 9 points. They hold the tiebreaker over the US. The U.S. needs to win in regulation if they want to jump into that top spot. Of course, they will play a bit of an interesting matchup tomorrow against the Germans, who for Germany, they're trying to claw themselves out of that relegation spot, and so that could become a very interesting game there. But the U.S. trying to win in regulation. If they don't win in regulation, then they really kind of just go all out for that regulation win, and so that's where it could get a little bit more interesting because they can't drop any lower, but an overtime or shootout win wouldn't actually help them in the grand scheme of the standings outside of tiebreakers going into that eventual kind of semifinal round where then you'd kind of rank higher if you get the extra points. And so that's definitely something to kind of consider, I'd say, more than anything else going into that game where if you do end up pulling your goaltender in a tie game to try and earn that extra spot up, it is a bit of a risk there for sure. But then you go down, and so Sweden and Denmark, they will play each other tomorrow. The winner will, of course, end up higher than the other. And then the other kind of interesting factor to consider is the fact that Germany, who's 1 point below both Sweden and Denmark both hold tiebreakers over the German team, which means that the Germans need at least 1 extra point than both Denmark and Sweden to finish above them. And so with Sweden and Denmark playing each other, it could present a bit of an interesting scenario where, of course, we could see, assuming either Swedes win or the Danes win, if Germany can get that 3 points, they'll leapfrog whichever team ends up losing. Same kind of idea. However, the worst case scenario for Germany tomorrow would be the overtime game where then Germany would have to win in regulation. If they don't win in regulation and that game goes to overtime or a shootout, then Germany would be in that relegation spot at the end of this tournament. And so a very long way of saying that as far as what to expect for tomorrow, it's going to be chaos, right? And so follow along with us. We'll be posting live on our Twitter X channel at OnTheFly1515, where we'll kind of give you live updates and let you know a little bit more about what's going on after each game is done, because it is still a little bit obscure as of this point what to expect, because especially that first game between Sweden and Denmark is going to be a huge kind of game that was going to have some pretty big implications down the line. Because if the Swedes end up losing that game, we could see, if the Germans end up beating the US, we could see the Swedes in the relegation game and not have a shot at the playoffs. But if the Danes end up, if the Danes lose, then the Danes also are now at risk for that spot. And so a very interesting set of combinations. The German win over the Czechs put this whole thing into motion, where now there's a big opportunity for the Czechs, or for the Germans, to kind of find their way back up into this tournament. And so it's going to be a really exciting last day, and we'll talk about the games now, starting at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, where we'll see Sweden taking on Denmark. Then 8 a.m. Canada and the Finns. 10 a.m. we'll see the USA and Germany taking on each other. And then the final day at 12 p.m. Eastern Time between Slovakia and Latvia. As far as what to expect in these games, Sweden and Denmark, I would once again say to expect the Swedes to really dominate this Danish team. At the very least, they'll dominate the pace of play. Look for the goaltending early on in this game. If the Danes go with Vilde, they have a shot in this game. If they don't, it's going to be a longer game for them. I don't necessarily expect them to be all that contending with the team like the Swedes, but if they have some good goaltending in net, if they run into a hot goaltender, this game could get really interesting, especially for both these teams, where now we're starting to look at relegation on the line. It's going to be a game to watch for sure. Whether or not the Danes are going to be able to be that competitive factor, it starts to feel a little bit more like that playoff type of game, where if you can get that good goaltending, the Swedes will start to kind of grip your stick a little tighter, and that's where we could see an upset in the making. A game to definitely keep an eye on at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 o'clock p.m. noon Central European Time. Then the second game of the day between Canada and Finland at 8 a.m. This will be a big game as well for the Finns. They're the only team that hasn't lost yet at this tournament. And so we'll see if that changes tomorrow against a pretty good Canadian team where they have struggled early at this tournament. They've been getting progressively better with each of their games, and now we're going to see what they can do against arguably the best team in their group. We saw, of course, them just beat the Slovaks the other day, and of course, Slovaks beat Canada. And so if there's any transfer there, the Finns should go out and beat Canada. But I think that game is going to be a really good one, so keep an eye on there to see which team can come out on top in that one. The longer the game goes, overtime favors the Finns. Canada wants to try and win this game in regulation, as we just talked about a little bit before. And so keep an eye out for this one, 8 a.m. between Finland and Canada. Then the USA taking on Germany at 10 a.m. This game really will probably only matter depending on the Sweden-Denmark result. We'll see whether or not for this German team, if they're going to be able to find themselves out of the relegation spot. It will be very interesting to see. I would say what you want to kind of look for in this game is whether or not the US can get off to that kind of early start. The longer this game goes where it's tight, and we saw the same things with the Czechs, the harder it is for this US team to really be able to separate themselves. We saw what they could do against the Swedish team the other day. If they can continue that and continue to find that offense, they're going to be just fine in this game. But the other part that becomes a question mark is if the Swedes end up losing their game against Denmark, does the US end up throwing their game to try and knock out Sweden out of this tournament early on? That is something that obviously you don't really want to discuss, but it is definitely something to consider, because the Swedes coming into this tournament, one of the better teams on paper, and yes, the US just routed them the other day, but it is going to be definitely something to keep an eye on there. The USA and Germany at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 o'clock Central European. And the last game of the day between Latvia and Slovakia. My game of the day here, I think realistically, both games over in Group A, Canada and the Finns as well, are going to be your games of the day. Depending on what happens as well with that Sweden-Denmark game, if the Swedes get upset, then the Germany-US game has to be a must-watch game, just because of the fact that there is the potential for the Swedes to get relegated at this tournament, or go to the relegation game at the very least. But still, definitely something to keep an eye on. 12 o'clock between Latvia and Slovakia. That game, I'd say, is probably going to be one of the more tighter games we see. I know I've caught a lot of flack for that prediction back in our prediction video. Obviously, this tournament hasn't necessarily gone exactly to plan to this point, but what I would say is these two teams are extremely close. And so especially on home ice, we tend to see teams like Latvia do, teams combating on teams on home ice like the Slovaks are. We tend to see teams like Latvia be very successful because of the fact that they are able to kind of hold games out longer than what they should be. You get a little bit of extra pressure. The home crowd starts to feel that pressure a little bit more, and it reflects onto the actual players. And so especially at the U18 level, I think this Latvian team has the potential to pull off that big upset against the Slovaks. We'll see whether or not they are going to be able to pull off a win there. Once again, it doesn't matter for Latvia, so whether or not they play their best players still remains to be seen. They can't move up in the standings, they can't move down. And so this game, as far as the standings go, relatively meaningless. But as far as momentum goes, you're going to go into a tough game against the US. For the Slovaks, or for the Latvians, this is a game against Slovakia where they need to be at their best. Definitely want to keep an eye on there. 12 o'clock noon, 6 p.m. Central European, and 7 o'clock Eastern European time. Definitely stay tuned for that one. Once again, your games of the day. Canada against the Finns at 8 a.m. Eastern, as well as Latvia and Slovakia at 12 noon. We will break down all of it tomorrow and take a look ahead to the playoff picture, plus more as always. But if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you really like, subscribing, tell all your friends, comment down below your thoughts on day 5 of the Men's Under 18 World Championships. Until next time, see you.